When it comes to miking up a drum kit, I actually find that most people find this to be the hardest instrument to mic. Now, yes, there's so many different bits of the drum kit there. Actually, I'd like to propose that we break it down into little bits, and then we can look at each section one by one and build it up as we go. So, actually, for most church settings, do you need to mic up the drum kit? Well, that's a really important question that you need to ask yourself before you carry on watching the rest of this section. In most churches, maybe of even 200 to 400 people or larger, you might find that the drum kit acoustically doesn't need any reinforcement. If I've only got one microphone, actually I'd suggest using that on the kick drum. Now the reason for that is that the low frequencies and the thud produced by the kick drum gets lost much quicker than, for example, the snare drum or the hi-hats, the cymbals. These tend to cut through a lot more and will travel to the back of your venue, whereas the kick drum will just get lost much earlier. Now, when miking up a kick drum, I'd strongly recommend using a dedicated, specialised kick drum mic. For example, this is an Audix D6. It's a very cost-effective microphone. It's about £150, $150. It's a great mic for a kick drum. For me, you can mic it in a number of different ways, but my preference would be straight into the hole on the front skin. You'll have to experiment a little bit with how far in or out you go, because you'll get a different tone according to the microphone and the type of drum that you're working with. Some people actually prefer to mic right inside the drum towards the front skin. By doing this, you're inside the drum, so you're going to still get the resonance and the boom and the bottom end of the kick drum, but you'll also get plenty of slap from the beater head hitting that front skin. But you might find it to be too boomy inside, in which case, if you can't resolve it with a bit of padding inside the kick drum, then try moving the mic further outside of the drum. As I say, try the hole on the front skin or back a little bit more, and you can work out the right balance between slap and boom. So if I've got the opportunity to add a second microphone in, my preference would be to go onto the hi-hats. Now, if the bass drum is doing the boom sound, the first beat of the bar, the hi-hats are marking the tempo. Actually, sometimes I find that the hi-hats can be a little bit lost in the context of a big band mix. So by putting a mic on the hats, we can really bring these out to the fore. The best position for a hi-hat mic is not, in my opinion, to one side, like this, because as the hi-hats then close, you get a puff of air going into the microphone. Personally, I don't like this as a solution. I would much rather bring the mic up and experiment with how close I get to the cymbal itself. The closer you go, the more stick noise you're going to get. The further out you come, the more other components of the drum kit you're going to be picking up. In this context, I'm going to be using a microphone that's designed to pick up high frequencies. This is a pencil condenser microphone, an AKG C451. It's perfect for a hi-hat because it's really good at picking those high frequency nuances. If you're really stuck, SM57 is a great way to go. Otherwise, maybe even a vocal microphone. As I say, if you've only got two mics, by miking the kick drum and the hi-hats, actually you get enough of the rest of the drum kit coming through that you're still going to have a nice balance when you're mixing these microphones in with the sound coming from the acoustic drum kit itself. For example, from the hi-hats, we're going to get quite a bit of snare bleeding through, but that's no bad thing. Certainly in a two-mic context, having that snare coming in is just going to reinforce it a little bit into the further reaches of the venue. When it comes to using four mics, which would be the next step up, opinions vary about what you can do. So we've already got a mic in our kick drum, and we've got a mic on our hi-hats, which is also picking up a little bit of snare. You could go for the route of a pair of overhead microphones like this. This is going to pick up the rest of the kit. Again, it's going to pick up the snare drum a little bit. It's also going to pick up the toms and the cymbals for you, so you're going to get a nice representation of the whole drum kit going through the PA. For overhead drum microphones, a large diaphragm condenser, like these Shure Beta 27s, is absolutely perfect. Equally, you could use a pair of pencil condensers coming in. You've just got to make sure that they're pointing in the right direction. Remember that a large diaphragm condenser like this picks up on the flat side at the moment it's pointing down, whereas a pencil condenser, it points at the source. So just make sure you get direction correct first. Height is also important. If you go too high, you're going to pick up everything else that's going around on the stage, including foldback monitors and all sorts of other noises. If you come too low, you run the risk of close miking particular parts of the drum kit. It might be a ride cymbal or a crash cymbal, for example. So you want to find a happy medium between the height and the low. You'll have to experiment with exactly what's right for you because it will vary according to how high each drummer likes his hardware. I like to start with maybe a foot to 2 foot away for my overheads and then adjust accordingly. Now, opinions differ as to exactly where to place the pair of microphones that you've got as overheads. At the moment, I've got these as a distant pair. Some people like to go for a close pair and fan them out so that they point in different directions. Effectively, you're splitting the drum kit in half. Whatever you do, experiment and find out what works best for your application. Sometimes there can be a real tendency, especially with drum overhead mics, to push them up into the mix just because you've got them. Now remember, we should be listening to the overall sound as we mix and balancing artistically as appropriate. Just because you've got mics on the desk doesn't mean you need to push them up. Often you'll find that the drum kit is mixed too loud just because we feel the need to push the overhead mics up. For this reason, actually I'd like to suggest a different way of using a 4-mic technique. For me, I'm going to use a kick drum, a snare drum, a hi-hat and a single overhead. By doing these 4, I'm able to isolate the 3 key components of the drum kit, and then I've got my overhead there if I need to just lift the toms a little bit for a bit more of drum kit reinforcement. Okay, so here's my snare drum, and imagine that the drummer's sitting in front of it and hitting it from this side, okay? Which means that actually I'd like to put my mics on the far side, so it would be the front of the drum kit as we look. Of course, we need to be aware practically that any mics we're placing in and around the snare drum are not going to be impeding the drummer's movement of sticks. The last thing we want is to have a nice smack on the microphone from a drumstick, waking everybody up in the congregation. In this example, I've mic'd the snare drum using a Sennheiser 904. This is designed specifically with a built-in clip so that the mic sits directly onto the snare drum. You could also use it on a tom-tom. The advantage of clipping a microphone straight onto the drum is that you haven't got to worry about juggling more mic stands into the already quite busy drum kit area. Now, opinions differ about how close you should get the mic to the skin. For example, I could take the mic really tight down to the skin and I'll get quite a bright pingy sound and a bit more skin noise. If I take the mic further up and away from the skin, then actually I'm going to get a little bit more of the depth of the snare drum. The capsule then should be pointing right into the heart of the drum where the stick is landing. This is going to give me the best possible tone of the drum. Now it might be that you haven't got a specialist clip mic like this one and you've got your trusty SM57. Now I would use it in exactly the same way and position it in exactly the same position, but instead I'm now going to have to work with the drummer to make sure that my mics and my mic stands aren't going to impede his playing. Okay, so there's a couple of different ways of miking up a drum kit with 4 mics. Option 1, kick, hats and a pair of overheads. Option 2, kick, hats, snare and a single overhead. If you're going to do that, here's the order of priority in which you should be miking these things up. Kick drum is first, then the hi-hats. Then snare. For me, I would then go toms first and cymbals afterwards. If you're already miking up your toms, actually you might find that you don't need to mic up your cymbals because you'll get enough bleed through of the cymbals into the tom mics, which is actually very nicely and conveniently balanced for us. Then the bleed through we're getting on the cymbals into our tom mics is going to naturally reinforce the splashy sound of the cymbals that's already going to be washing throughout the venue. Now it might be that you want to adopt what quite a lot of people do and start double miking parts of the drum kit. We're into really advanced miking techniques here. For example, a lot of people like to double mic the snare drum. When double miking your snare drum, You'd have your mic on the top, but you would also have a mic coming from underneath as well. The mic on top is going to get a lot of the skin sound and the boom. The mic from underneath is actually going to get a lot more of the spring sound. By balancing the two then on the desk, it gives you the ability to change the sound of the snare drum according to the song's needs. When you start to double mic instruments, like snare drums or even kick drums, I would strongly recommend that you check on the phasing of the different inputs coming into the desk. For example, a lot of people think that if I'm double micing the snare, I have to have one of the mics out of phase with the other one. I would say, trust your ears. If you rather the sound of one mic in phase and the other one out, do that. Keep pressing the button and actually find out what your overall preference is. That's the right way, not what a textbook might tell you. When we're close micing the drum kit like this, we can actually get away with quite a flat EQ setting on our desk. For me, I would definitely be putting the high-pass filters in on almost all of the drum kit, except for the kick drum and perhaps the floor tom as well. They are the only two parts of the drum kit that are really going to go down low enough to warrant keeping the high-pass filter out of play on our signal chain. EQ-wise, as I say, I'm going to keep it quite flat, except on a hi-hat. For me, the hi-hat's probably the one instrument that I can afford to go quite radical on my EQ. I'm going to wind out a lot of the lows and the low mids. Really, I'm after just the sound from a snare drum. Of course, you need to check with the drummer to work out what style of music he likes, what sound he likes from his drum kit. It's always worth doing this separate from any rehearsals or sound checks that you've got going on in church, so that you can work out this is a really nice drum sound for our church and it matches the indigenous expressions of music that your church is creating. One final thought about drum kits. Often you can get a ping or a ring coming from the drum. Actually, in that context, don't try and EQ it out because you'll just make the drum kit sound really bad. The best thing to do is to fix the ring at the source. Speak to the drummer. Maybe the skin needs retuning. Maybe just a little bit of gaffer tape, duct tape stuck to the top of the skin will get rid of that ringing and you've fixed your problem without even touching your mixing desk.